Our second speaker this morning will be Dr. Perry Hamalis, who is Cecilia Schneller-Mueller Professor of Religion at North Central College in Illinois. Professor Hamalis studied at Boston College, Holy Cross, a Greek Orthodox School of Theology, and the University of Chicago. His research interests are in the field of religious ethics, with a special interest in virtue ethics and the intersection of religion and political philosophy. He is the author of Formed by Death, Insights for Ethics from Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which will be published shortly by University of Notre Dame Press. He serves as consultant on the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches. Dr. Hamalis will speak on Orthodox political theology and war ethics.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. The title of my talk is Just Peacemaking and Christian Realism, Possibilities for Moving Beyond the Impasse in Orthodox Christian War Ethics. It's a little bit more practical, a little bit less theologically thick and deep, perhaps, as my dear friend Telly's talk was. But certainly the theological claims are there grounding what I'm about to say. So let me start by just saying a couple of introductory comments. From Australia and South Korea to Canada and the United States, aspects of Eastern Orthodox Christianity are gradually becoming acknowledged both inside and outside of the academy in countries where Orthodox Christians constitute a very small percentage of the population. Notwithstanding this growth in visibility, most people, including many Orthodox, are not clear about the stance on ethical issues, or the stances on ethical issues that the Orthodox Church derives from its theological and spiritual resources. When confronting, for example, the immense spiritual, moral, and political challenges presented by war, questions quickly arise. Which of the major ethical approaches to wars does the Orthodox Church embrace? Pacifism, just war theory, political realism, holy war, some other option? How does one or more of these approaches express Orthodoxy's distinctive theological tradition and way of life? And what, if anything, does the Orthodox Church have to add to current reflection on the issue of war? Several Eastern Orthodox theologians have expressed dissatisfaction with all four of the predominant ethical stances that structure responses to the challenges of war in the West: pacifism, just war, holy war, and political realism, arguing that none of them fits comfortably with an Orthodox theological ethical vision. For example, Fathers Stanley Heracus, Alexander Webster, John McGuckin, and Philip Lemasters have insisted upon the distinctiveness of Orthodoxy's teachings on this issue vis-a-vis other Christian communions. Heracus stresses the Orthodox tradition's general affirmation of the peace ideal and writes, quote, "There are, however, great difficulties for the Church in dealing with the Christian faith's pro-peace bias in a world fraught with sin, evil, and injustice." Continuing with the quote, "My point is that the East has responded to the issue in a way that is different from that of the West." End quote. Webster, in contrast, contends that, quote, "Orthodox tradition is amazingly to Western Christians bifurcated. Orthodox moral tradition simultaneously recognizes both absolute pacifism and what I would prefer to term the justifiable war ethic." End quote. McGuckin notes that, quote, "Even when the situation of war seemed unavoidable and might be said to be for reasonable and defensible goals, the Orthodox Church has never endorsed it with anything comparable to the theory of the just war that has played such a big part in the consciousness of Western Christianity." End quote. And Lemasters, reporting the results of a recent international conference on Orthodox peace ethics, states, though the consultations revealed diversity on many dimensions of the application of Orthodox tradition, a point of consensus was that Eastern Christianity interprets issues of war and peace in distinctive ways that do not align perfectly with the dominant categories of Christianity in the West. End quote. You see the pattern here? While their own accounts of Orthodoxy's teachings on war lack uniformity, Heracus, Webster, McGuckin, and Lemasters proclaim in unison that Orthodoxy's teachings differ in some fundamental way from the main stances articulated in Western, Roman Catholic, and Protestant churches. Put differently, we're not all on the same page about Orthodoxy's teachings on war, say the Orthodox, but we know we're not of the same mind as Roman Catholics and Protestants. To be sure, the lack of harmony among Orthodox voices, coupled with the univocal rejection of Western teachings, merits a skeptical reaction. Yet some legitimate factors contribute to this perceived East-West difference on the topic of war. Historically, in the Christian East, there was no single church father who wrote extensively and systematically on the subject. From the 4th through the 14th centuries, none of the greatest theologians of the Byzantine Church, St. John Chrysostom, Maximus the Confessor, St. John of Damascus, St. Gregory Palamas, just to name a few, none of them ever addressed the issue of war in the focused manner that Augustine, Gratian, Thomas Aquinas, or Erasmus of Rotterdam did. Neither was there a controversy in the Orthodox Church like the one between the Reformers, Luther, Calvin, etc., and the Radical Reformers, Munzer, Mino Simons, etc., in which the question of whether or not Christians can or should use the sword was a central point of contention. Furthermore, and very significantly, the Orthodox Church never endorsed or practiced crusades. As McGuckin writes, the medieval Eastern Church under the Byzantine emperors never erected a theology of holy war or just war, despite the many temptations to do so, as the borders of Byzantium were systematically eroded by Islamic forces. Lemasters agrees with McGuckin, noting that Orthodox military saints were not canonized because of their military prowess or death in battle, as they would be if Orthodoxy endorsed holy war, but rather because of the ways they imitated Christ's example of nonviolence and mercy, despite finding themselves amidst the horrors of war. In short, different historical factors and the different theological styles of Western and Eastern Christianity led to different approaches to the challenges of peace and war. Holy war and political realism, as well as pacifism and just war as moral concepts that developed outside of Orthodox Christianity, do not seem to cohere organically when applied within the Orthodox tradition. They constitute a foreign moral language, one that the Orthodox speak, at best, with a thick accent. Where then does this leave the Orthodox? Orthodoxy's rejection of the four major stances within war ethics presents a situation where I believe only three viable options remain. Number one, the Orthodox Church defines its own stance using language, concepts, and sources appropriate to orthodoxy, and then communicates its stance to the broader public, academic and non-academic. Number two, the Orthodox Church identifies closely with one or more of the lesser-known but already existing approaches that have carved out some room within the discourse on war, and then build constructively and distinctively from this starting point. Or three, the Orthodox Church effectively excuses itself from the table, deciding either to remain silent or simply to throw stones at other churches' positions without offering a coherent alternative. The third option, I believe, and I hope you agree, is a disgrace and a betrayal of the Church's mission in the world. Orthodoxy has theological, ethical resources to offer, and to refuse to articulate a substantive response on an issue of such gravity opens the Orthodox Church to accusations of pastoral negligence and ethical laziness, if not misanthropia. The first option is appealing in some ways as the most organic to the Orthodox tradition, but given the current reality, it seems quixotic, politically ineffective, and unecumenical. This leaves the second option, embracing one or more existing approaches that lie outside of the big four, and then building from there. And I believe personally that this is the most promising direction for the Orthodox Church in the near future, by identifying, even conditionally, with at least one lesser known but already existing approach. The Orthodox gain visibility, a seat at the table, and a substantive set of core concepts and principles. The main challenge, of course, is finding an appropriate Western partner. So, partnering option number one, just peacemaking. Among the lesser-known traditions of reflection on the challenges of war, there are two approaches that hold particular promise as partners for the Orthodox. And the first of these is the just peacemaking tradition. Focused on preventing war and taking Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers," as their driving principle, proponents of just peacemaking articulate and seek to apply a set of approximately 10 broadly construed practices that effectively reduce the probability and reality of war. Examples include supporting nonviolent direct action, taking independent initiatives to reduce threat, using cooperative conflict resolution, acknowledging responsibility for conflict and injustice while seeking forgiveness through repentance, fostering just and sustainable economic development, and advancing human rights and democracy, working with emerging cooperative forces, reducing offensive weapons, the weapons trade, and encouraging grassroots peacemaking initiatives. Just peacemaking proponents regard their mission in essentially practical terms. As Glenn Stassen writes, the test of the truth and realism of just peacemaking theory is not whether war nevertheless sometimes breaks out, especially where these practices are not used. It does, and it will. The test is whether the empirical claim is true, that each of these practices is preventing some wars. The unambiguous aim of just peacemaking is to identify and employ individual and communal practices that effectively prevent wars. By identifying the core of their teachings as practices, not principles or ideals, proponents of just peacemaking are underscoring a pragmatic grounding and calling people of faith to action. The practices of just peacemaking are transforming initiatives. As initiatives, they require more than passive speculation and theorizing. They require forward movement, leadership, and action in the world by persons and communities. As transformative practices, they are limited to those initiatives that reshape relationships among persons, groups, and nations. Of course, not all practices are transformative, and not all transformative practices are reshaping relationships toward peace. However, the practices endorsed by just peacemaking are initiatives that change the dynamic between conflicting parties and yield less violence and destruction. The practical core of just peacemaking, however, is not theologically empty. As Glenn Stassen has articulated, just peacemaking's transformative initiatives express an incarnational Christology, and its current paradigm grew out of a, quote, thicker interpretation of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. While the practices themselves are not necessarily limited to confessing Christians, they are described and defended by Christian theological and ethical convictions about the person, example, and teachings of Christ. These are not secularized or watered-down initiatives. They are initiatives that faithful Christians can endorse as genuine expressions of what it means to be a member of the church. As the above account suggests, proponents of just peacemaking see themselves as providing an alternative to the divide among Christians between pacifism and just war on at least two levels. First, they've shifted the focus of Christian moral reflection to an earlier point in the phenomenon by attending to the social factors that often lead to the outbreak of war and to the practices that slow or stop such outbreaks. In essence, just peacemaking teaches that regardless of whether one believes that wars are never morally justifiable, pacifism, or sometimes justifiable, just war theory, we can agree that preventing wars is, at least, morally praiseworthy, if not a moral responsibility. Second, just peacemaking provides an alternative to the identification of pacifism with doing nothing, except protesting, and of just war theory with doing something violent through military action. It advocates an active approach to peace, a waging peace, which provides a way for people and communities to get involved with constructive social political practices that are nonviolent. While a comprehensive account of just peacemaking or of its compatibility with orthodoxy lies beyond our scope here, I believe that Orthodox Christians can and should embrace the just peacemaking tradition as part of the Orthodox Church's response to the challenges of war. First, as a relatively new stance within war and peace ethics, just peacemaking does not bring with it the historical and confessional baggage many Orthodox associate with both pacifism and just war theory. Developed by an ecumenical and interdisciplinary group of scholars, just peacemaking is not wedded to a single denomination or to a reified theological tradition. Practically, this helps Orthodox leaders and scholars avoid accusations of being too Catholic or too Protestant in their response to war, regardless of the legitimacy of such labels. Furthermore, as a paradigm that is still maturing and that has been ecumenical from the start, just peacemaking is more open to incorporating Orthodox insights into its teachings. Second, just peacemaking's pragmatic moral grounding and emphasis upon practices for effectively preventing war resonates deeply with Orthodoxy's approach to ethics. Orthodox ethics tends, I believe, to work more personally and contextually from the ground up than theoretically and abstractly from the top down. While Orthodox doctrines are understood as universally true, Orthodox ethics pays close attention to and privileges the uniqueness of each person and community. The spiritual resources within Orthodoxy for responding to the challenges of war constitute more of a dynamic praxis of peace than an abstract, systematic formula for assessing the moral legitimacy of violence. This practical and contextual quality of Orthodox ethics fits much more comfortably with just peacemaking than with any of the four predominant stances. And third, incarnational Christology and commitment to Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, the theological, ethical claims that are most deeply intertwined with just peacemaking, are fully compatible with Orthodox theology. For example, a recent statement by the Orthodox representatives for the International Ecumenical Peace Convocation of the World Council of Churches employs incarnational Christology when it states, quote, "In every dimension of life, the faithful are called to embody the way of Christ as fully as possible in the circumstances that they face, to forgive enemies, to work for the reconciliation of those who become estranged, to overcome the divisions of race, nationality, and class, to care for the poor, to live in harmony with others, and to use the created goods of the world for the benefit of all." End quote. Orthodoxy's traditional affirmation of Christ's full divinity and full humanity implies the belief that Christ's sovereignty extends over all dimensions of life, and that Christians' membership in the body of Christ carries imperatives for Christ-like action in the world, here and now. And here I think my talk maybe connects with Telly's most directly. Strikingly, the document quoted above is entitled, quote, "Called to be craftsmen of peace and justice," drawing its language from St. Nicholas Cabasilas, the 14th century sacramental theologian, who taught that, quote, Christians as disciples of Christ who made all things for peace are to be craftsmen or craftspeople of peace." Beautiful quote from Cabasilas. While these passages suggest a compatibility between Orthodox theology and the theological claims shaping just peacemaking, they also provide a glimpse into how just peacemaking could be enhanced through Orthodoxy's rich theological and hermeneutical tradition. From Orthodoxy's sacramental and environmental theology to its insights on the dynamics of repentance and forgiveness, there is extraordinary potential for mutual enhancement between the just peacemaking and the Orthodox traditions. Finally, Orthodox should embrace the just peacemaking approach to peace and war because many, if not most, of just peacemaking's 10 endorsed practices are already part of Eastern Orthodoxy's social witness, and those that are not should be. Consider the way in which International Orthodox Christian Charities, IOCC, the humanitarian aid agency of the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops of North and Central America, fits with the, quote, foster just and sustainable economic development practice. Since its inception, IOCC has provided nearly $500 million in humanitarian relief, sustainable development, and self-help programs to people in need across the globe. Similarly, just peacemaking's encourage grassroots peacemaking groups practice has been a transforming initiative in many Orthodox contexts. In fact, Orthodoxy boasts a level of lived experience in this area unmatched by any other Christian communion because of its presence as the largest Christian church in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. For example, youth peace camps, which bring together young people from different religious and or ethnic backgrounds, have been sponsored and offered by Orthodox communities in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Greece, and Cyprus, all countries where Orthodox have long histories of tension and conflict with members of other faith and ethnic communities. Other efforts include the establishment of the Institute for Peace Studies in Eastern Christianity and of local and national chapters of the Orthodox Peace Fellowship. Initiatives like these need to be supported and expanded by Orthodox advocates for peace. As Father Emmanuel Klopsis has eloquently urged, advocacy for peace must not stop with praying the litanies of the liturgy. We can pray these petitions with integrity only if we offer ourselves as instruments for God's peace in the world, only if we live them out in relation to the challenges to peace that exist among peoples and nations. End quote. While the Orthodox Christian ideal is to avoid war and promote peace through prayer, diplomacy, and just peacemaking practices, the Orthodox tradition also offers resources that can illuminate the spiritual roots and challenges of war that can help shape a normative Christian response once a war has begun. And here, a second lesser-known Western approach, Christian realism, also seems to cohere in important ways with Orthodoxy. This ethical tradition mines the writings of St. Augustine and of 20th century public theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and emphasizes the value of reconnecting theological anthropology to moral reflection on war. While St. Augustine is traditionally claimed by proponents of just war theory, Christian realists find his theology of history, his distinction between the earthly city and the city of God, and his realistic account of human corruption to be salient to present-day social ethics. Reinhold Niebuhr, writing in the aftermath of World War I and throughout the entirety of World War II, was dissatisfied with both pacifism's tendency toward detached idleness and with just war theory's tendency toward rationalizing war. While he never considered himself to be a systematic moral theorist, Niebuhr's ethical vision has since been called Christian realism. Returning to this essay's main question, why should Orthodox thinkers and leaders look to the Christian realist tradition when articulating normative responses to the challenges of war? What is it about this tradition that makes it more appealing than pacifism, just war, holy war, or political realism? And I'll just offer a limited analysis here. First, unlike political realism, both Christian realism and Orthodoxy stress the essentially spiritual nature of the roots of war and the need for a robust theological anthropology, for a nuanced and honest account of who we are as human beings, both fallen and redeemed, if we are to respond appropriately and effectively to war's challenges. Edmund Santuri provides a concise account of Christian realism's perspective when he states, quote, "For the Christian realist, political life displays in a particularly transparent way the fallen condition of the world. Political life depicts in a particularly transparent way the fallen condition of the world. Describing the theology of the fall's significance within Orthodox thought, Christos Yanaras writes, quote, "The fall of man is not simply a particular twist to Orthodox anthropological theorizing, but the axis or key to understanding human beings, the world, and history. On the one side, the truth of the fall, and on the other side, the truth of deification, define the fact of the church itself and give meaning to its existence and its historical mission." End quote. Yanadas rightly notes that the fall, with its consequences for humanity and all of creation, is a hermeneutical key to the Orthodox faith. Furthermore, if we think about orthodoxy within a therapeutic framework, the church as hospital and God as physician, then a theology of the fall provides nothing less than a diagnosis of humanity's illness, the accuracy and illuminative force of which is paramount to understanding and following the way to healing or salvation. Second, orthodoxy shares Christian realism's emphasis on the belief that both freedom and finitude characterize humanity's fallen condition. For the Orthodox, this means that human beings retain our free will, our aphthexousia, as well as our dignity as beings made in the divine image, even after the entrance of death and sin into the world. Put differently, while the reality of sin and of the tendencies within us toward violence, oppression, and injustice are acknowledged in their horrific depths, the realist part, there is within both Orthodox and Christian realist thinkers an abiding hopefulness about humanity's potential for goodness and holiness through God's grace and the right use of human freedom, the Christian part. So Christian realism. Reinhold Niebuhr links human freedom and finitude to the divine image and the fallen condition in a way that resonates with orthodoxy's theological anthropology. He writes, quote, "The high estimate of human stature implied in the concept of image of God stands in paradoxical juxtaposition to the low estimate of human virtue in Christian thought. Man is a sinner. His sin is defined as rebellion against God." End quote. For Niebuhr and other Christian realists, an honest assessment of human beings demands an affirmation of our extraordinary status as creatures made in God's image and capable of self-transcendence, as well as an acknowledgement of our proclivity for rebellion against God. Responding faithfully to the challenge of war requires that we recognize both poles of human possibility. Third, affirming humanity's capacity for both extremes on the personal level leads Christian realists and Orthodox to a sober realism about political possibilities within history. Consider the following anecdote from Orthodoxy's ascetical tradition. Two monks had this conversation. The first said, "I cannot understand why the Lord does not grant peace to the world, even if only a single person implored him to do so." And the second replied, "And how could there be complete peace in the world if but a single malicious man remained?" This short narrative reveals several insights. It affirms the reality of human freedom, both for seeking God's help and for rebelling against God. It provides a brief but striking theodicy, and it expresses a healthy skepticism about any promises for heaven on earth. One of the most valuable contributions of the Christian realism tradition is its critique of utopian visions of every type. As Jean Bethke Elshtain argues, this thread within Christian realism goes back at least to St. Augustine's City of God and is as relevant today as it was when Augustine developed it within the context of 5th century Rome. In critiquing this political tendency, Niebuhr primarily has Stalin and Hitler in mind, but he insisted that the same temptations extend to democracies and to every other type of human community. No political system is immune to idolatrous efforts to self-identify with the apex of historical accomplishment, whether the substance of this claim is a classless society or the establishment of freedom and democracy. Within the context of war's ethical challenges, this thread serves as a vital reminder that while human judgments on the meaning of history are never absolute, the deaths that wars bring are. Let me close here. So, be happy to talk more about this. In a passage In a passage that pulls together several affinities between Christian realism and orthodoxy, and that also highlights some areas through which orthodoxy can make a constructive contribution, Archimandrite Sophrony, a contemporary of Niebuhr, writes, quote, "One of the first consequences of the primordial fall was fratricide. And ever since, that sin has been the principal sin throughout history. The nature of man as a whole was torn to shreds. People meeting with their like do not recognize themselves, do not see our common unity of life. Struggling for their own individual existence, they slay their fellows, not understanding that thereby they plunge themselves into death in common with them. Baneful passion has ousted the bonds of love in people's souls, and replace them with the urge to repress one's neighbor for the sake of a comfortable life for oneself and one's offspring. Because of this benightedness, our whole world is plunged in an ocean of blood, a hostile atmosphere, a nightmare of mutual destruction. The sin of our forefathers brought about universal dissolution. To this day, humankind has not only failed to release itself from the spirit of fratricide, but continues to plunge ever deeper into lethal delirium. The experience of centuries has taught humanity nothing. Victory through violence is always and inevitably short-term in this world. Translated into eternity, it will prove a never-ending disgrace. All ye are brethren, said the teacher, Christ. One is your Father, which is in heaven." Let me just conclude. I've argued that Orthodox leaders and thinkers should embrace two lesser-known approaches within peace and war ethics: just peacemaking and Christian realism. Embracing these two traditions is significant for two overarching reasons. First, as I've sought to demonstrate above, both just peacemaking and Christian realism display close affinities with basic elements within Orthodoxy's theological tradition. While I do not mean to suggest that there are no differences or points of contention between these ethical traditions and Orthodoxy, I believe the points of shared conviction and teaching are plentiful and are sufficient both to merit mutual endorsement on a general level and to justify focused efforts to examine further connections. Any of you grad students out there, feel free to take this project up. Second, by embracing the just peacemaking and Christian realist traditions, Orthodoxy would gain not only two rich sets of ethical resources, but also two sets of concepts and language that are already recognized within the public and scholarly discourse on peace and war. Furthermore, this can be done without compromising Orthodox convictions. Put differently, just peacemaking and Christian realism can move Orthodox Christianity beyond the impasse it currently confronts. They provide a way for Orthodoxy to avoid the scylla of leaving the table and the Charybdis of pacifisms, just war theories, holy wars, and political realism's incompatibility with its historical and theological tradition. May Orthodox leaders and scholars have the courage, the humility, and the resolve to explicitly and deliberately embrace just peacemaking and Christian realism, offering the treasures of our tradition to their advocates with generosity and accepting their treasures with gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Perry. Again, a very challenging talk for us, which certainly is highly relevant in the Canadian context today. As you were talking, Perry, particularly when you were talking about the different practices of peacemaking, I was thinking that in some ways it characterized what used to be Canadian policy some decades ago, very much the peacekeeping role of Canada in the world. But unfortunately, in the last 2 or 3 decades, Canada has moved away from that role, and we are now struggling with the possibility and the question of whether it might be desirable to return to a more peacekeeping role, particularly in the light of the Canadian involvement in the war in the Middle East at the present time. So it's a very relevant talk and very relevant challenge that you have brought to us today.